thank you very much for coming along this afternoon for our next session in the Glasgow Forum for Scots Law series, where we're looking at private law and public policy. And that was a topic that came up last year in quite a lot of our discussions, and this year we thought we would make it a theme, and we're delighted that Victoria is here, Victoria Sutherland from the University of Glasgow, who has looked at a topic which I think is at the heart of our theme, looking at community benefit clauses, a relatively new idea in public procurement in Scotland. I mean, you can correct me. But
yeah, I'll talk about that a little bit at the beginning.
But I do pick up that lawyers in practice now are finding this an interesting clause to think about, but also a challenging one from a legal perspective about reviewing performance of this and how you might implement this particular clause. But also for us, actually looking at how this is working in practice is a rare occasion to look at the law in action, you might say. So we're really pleased, and I think the presentation may be based on a report which you did for the Scottish Government. So thank you very much for coming, and I will hand the floor over to you, and welcome to anyone who's watching online. Thank you for tuning in.
Okay, super. Can I give you there? So thank you very much for having me. As Stephen alluded to, my name is, I'm Victoria Sutherland, and I'm from a part of the University of Glasgow that's called the Training and Employment Research Unit. So we're based within the Adam Smith Business School. And I suppose what we do is our core work is doing contract research for governments, government agencies, local authorities, a whole range of different parts of the public sector. And normally they have an area of public policy that they're looking to develop new policies or new programmes, or they're looking to develop strategies, or they have things that are already in place that they'd like evaluated. So that's our kind of core work. We did this research in 2014, although it actually wasn't published until 2015, around the use and impact of community benefit clauses across Scotland. Now, Stephen had said that community benefits are a new thing, and in a sense they're not really a new thing. They have been kicking around for a really long time. But what has really changed in recent years is there has been a greater emphasis on them at the Scottish Government level. There has been a change in legislation, and I think really off the back of those two things, there's been increasing use of them. So they're a thing that have been around, but the use of it was relatively patchy, or at least, as far as we know, the use of it was relatively patchy. A big issue about community benefits is that whilst there had been a lot of research that had been done around, well, law is maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. There had been various pieces of research that had been done around community benefit clauses. Most of it was of the kind of how-to type. It was case studies of organisations that had used community benefits to really understand how people were using them. What there was a real lack of was any understanding of the extent to which community benefit clauses were being used and what impact they were having. So were they delivering what they were aiming to do? And looking more broadly, what impact was that having on Scottish economy, Scottish society? So in a sense, there were two reasons Scottish Government commissioned this research, or maybe there's two different ways that you can think about why they commissioned it. One was about plugging that gap, beginning to understand a bit more about to what extent are they being used and what impact are they having when they're being used. And then the second element was there was a Procurement Reform Act in 2014. And I'm going to talk about this in a little minute, but one of the things that is in that act is a requirement for public agencies to produce an annual monitoring report around their procurement. And as part of that, they knew that the Scottish Government knew that they were going to have to give some guidance in terms of what should be in that report. So the research was partly to help inform what should the monitoring data that they're being asked to collect be. You know, what would be useful to know, what would be useful to understand. In terms of how we did this, kind of usual things, I guess. We did a desk-based review of the literature on community benefits. We did an e-survey of public bodies across Scotland to try and develop a picture about the extent to which they were being used. And then there were 24 contracts that we looked at in detail. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm not really going to talk about the desk-based review of the literature because that's kind of dull. But what I am going to talk about is the e-survey of community benefit activity and the 24 contracts that we looked at. Okay, so I should say, and this is my slight anxiety about doing this session today, I am not a lawyer. And in fact, nobody in Terru is a lawyer. So we are a multidisciplinary team, but what that means is that we are people who are economists or geographers or from a community health background. So we've come at this very much in terms of a lot of our work is around employability, around skills development, around economic development. So we're coming at it from that direction, not from a legal perspective. But I think it is worth talking a little bit about the legislative background, A, because you guys are lawyers or at least work in the legal field, and therefore hopefully it puts it in a little bit of context for you, but also, as I hope will become clear, actually the fact that there's this act is really one of the big drivers behind the work that we ended up doing. So there's always been a little bit of a question around the legality of community benefit clauses. And one of the things that happened in 2014, so there were two things that were important in 2014. One was that the European Council adopted a number of new directives around public procurement. So public procurement is devolved to the Scottish Parliament, but, well, at least for the moment, the Scottish Parliament has to abide by EU legislation on it. And whilst there were a range of different things within those directives, what they did, which was important, was that they made the case for community benefits stronger. They made it much clearer that community benefits were something that were allowed and actually encouraged. The second thing that happened was there was the Procurement Reform Act at a Scottish level, and it always gets talked about as the national legislative framework for public procurement, but I haven't actually put it on the slide. The bit that comes at the end of that is it's the national legislative framework for public procurement that supports Scotland's economic growth. Okay, so it's not just that it's a framework with a purpose. So this is one of the reasons why there has been this increased focus on community benefits over recent years. I mean, on my first slide, I think I said there's been an increased focus since 2008. The interesting thing about 2008 is that it's when the economy, I was going to say imploded, but that's probably an inadvisable word to use, but it's when the economy was severely hit by the banking crisis and the subsequent recession. And in a sense, we should always be doing this with public funds. But actually, there was a real sense of we need to make sure we're getting every last, economic benefit we can get from the use of our public procurement. So, and this is not insignificant. In 2012-13, so that was the last year there was data for at the point at which we were doing this research, 2012-13, public procurement in Scotland was £10.4 billion. If you can get additional economic benefits off the back of that £10.4 billion, and it's not costing you extra money, this isn't, it isn't a policy that requires an investment from government, then that's why you get that extra focus. It's that, what can we get out of the money that we are already spending? So I think it's interesting when you look at the Procurement Act, there's things that touch on community benefits it's kind of almost interwoven into it. If you look at lots of different elements of that, there are things that either hint at or support or encourage community benefits. So the first of them is this sustainable procurement duty. So this requires public bodies to consider how the procurement process can do a number of things. And one of them, the one that appears out, is about to improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of the authority's area. So the authority's area, if you think about it, if it's a council, it's Glasgow City Council, it's Glasgow. If it's NHS Lanarkshire, then it's North Lanarkshire and South Lanarkshire council areas. It's whatever their patch is. So there's this duty, but there isn't a duty to do it. There's a duty to consider it, and that, as you look at the different elements of the Act, it's interesting that often it's about consider. It's not about actually placing a duty on them to do community benefits, just to think about them. There's also one in there which is about the supply chain. It's about making sure that small and medium-sized enterprises and third sector bodies are, getting a kind of fair crack of the whip in relation to procurement. And there's also one that's around innovation. If they've got significant procurement expenditure anticipated for the next financial year, then they have to prepare a procurement strategy. And again, that's got to include a statement on their use of community benefits. And then I'll maybe come back to point 4 in a second. If it's a contract of more than £4 million, then they have to consider whether or not to impose community benefit requirements. And then finally, and this is the thing that led on to our work in particular, is they will need to prepare an annual procurement report. I think the other thing that's in the Act that is interesting for us to think about in the context of today's discussion is about what a community benefit means in relation to the Act. So it is a contractual requirement imposed by a procuring organisation relating to training and recruitment, the availability of subcontracting opportunities, or other activities that can improve the well-being of an area. So an example for you is, let's say you are NHS Glasgow and you are building a new Southern General Hospital. That is a massive contract, so it's actually one of the 24 contracts that were included in the detailed bit of our research. That's an £842 million contract. So the main purpose of that contract is the building of a hospital. The community benefit clause is about, as part of the development of that, there will be X number of employment opportunities for unemployed individuals, or there will be X number of apprenticeship opportunities, or there will be work placement opportunities. So it can vary, and this is one of the really interesting things, is it's up to the procuring organisation to decide who their priority groups are. Okay, so in our research what we tended to find was it was pretty generic. It was generally unemployed individuals or young people who were outside education, employment or training. Okay, it was rare that you found anything where they had a more specific priority group that they were looking at. So a specific priority group would be something like, young people with disabilities, or young people from a minority ethnic community, for example. That was much, much rarer. It tended to be just about unemployment or young people outside education, employment and training. Okay, so in terms of what we found, so we sent this e-survey to 350 different public bodies across Scotland. Quite frankly, the fact that we're a country of 5 million people and we have 350 public bodies in and of itself, an interesting finding, I think. So we sent it to all of the local authorities, all of the different government agencies, alongside the Scottish Government, kind of central procurement, all the NHS central procurement, registered social landlords, so housing associations and the like, colleges and universities. So we sent it to 350 and we got 94 responses back from across the piece. And I suppose the first thing that we found was about 2/3 of them, in fact exactly 2/3 of them, were using community benefit clauses or had used them in the 5-year period prior to us sending the survey out to them. So that on one level seems like a reasonably good proportion. 2/3 is great, but it actually tells you that there's real scope to increase the number of public organisations that are using them. And remember that this was all happening around the time the Act was going through Parliament. It hadn't yet been passed, so it'll be interesting to see in a couple of years how this number has changed as a result of the Act. So there's real scope to increase the numbers there. The other place where there's scope to increase it is when you then look at those that are using it. So I think that was 62 of the 94 organisations. Only about a quarter were using them routinely. So we're using them across all, or at least the majority of their contracts. 2/3 were using them in a much more ad hoc way. So again, even where people are using them, there's real scope to increase the use of the CB clauses. I think another interesting thing that we found here was it varies a bit across the different types of organisation. So all of the local authorities that responded to the survey were using community benefit clauses, but all of the urban regeneration companies were using that replied were using community benefit clauses, partly because urban regeneration companies have a kind of remit around the regeneration of a specific area, so often very closely aligned with their goals as an organisation. But when you get to organisations maybe more like a housing association, a registered social landlord, the proportion was much lower. It was only about 1/3 of those organisations were using them. And kind of from what we found was that was often because they were relatively small. They maybe didn't have a dedicated procurement person, or maybe they had a very small team and there were just 1 or 2 in it, and just being able to find the resource to be able to do community benefits was difficult. When we asked them about why they were using them, the thing that came out most strongly was that using them helped them achieve their organisational goals. Okay, so for example, you're a local authority, you will have you'll have a plan for you as an organisation, but you'll be a signatory to the local single outcome agreement. And in the single outcome agreement, there's a target to reduce unemployment in the local area, and you use community benefits as a mechanism to help deliver that target. One of the things that was really interesting is you can use community benefit clauses in any public procurement, so the purchase of any kind of goods or service. But this is a historical thing. Historically, they've been used in construction contracts, the building of a new school, the building of a bridge. And we found that was still the case, that their potential to be used in the delivery of service contracts really isn't fully being capitalised on yet. In terms of those that weren't using them, the biggest reason that they weren't using them was because they were seen to be not relevant to the kinds of contracts that were being let. So again, this is a legacy of this being a thing that came out of construction contracts. So if you're a public agency and you're not building anything, chances are you don't necessarily see the relevance to you. You don't see how you can build it into the kinds of contracts that you let. There's also, over half of them flagged up issues about what using a community benefit clause would mean in terms of resources for them as an organisation. There's a perception that building in community benefit clauses, but also monitoring them, the ongoing management of them, is something that is going to be resource intensive, and people worry about whether or not they've really got those resources to do that. About 1 in 5 hadn't heard of community benefit clauses, and about 1 in 5 flagged up the fact that there was a lack of clarity about the legal position. They were concerned about the legality of using community benefit clauses. So those two together tell us that despite the fact that actually prior to this there had been a big push from Scottish Government in terms of understanding, kind of increasing awareness, increasing understanding, there's actually still a job to be done there. I think the other interesting thing that came out of the survey was that when we looked at those that were using the community benefit clauses, most of them had at least one policy or process in place to help support that. So that could be that actually you just have a community benefit policy as an organisation. You have written down where they're to be used, you know, so they'll be used on contracts of over 2 million or over 10 million or whatever it is. It could be that you've got a champion, so that's maybe a procurement officer or perhaps someone at a more senior level. We also asked about policies around monitoring the delivery. You know, so do they have systems and processes in place to support that, and so forth. So depending on which policy we asked about, it was kind of between kind of a third and 2/3 of them had each of the different kinds of policies we found. Something really interesting within that, though, is that those that were using the community benefit clauses routinely were more likely than those that were using them on a more ad hoc basis to have each of the different types of policy or structure or process. But what we don't know is which is the chicken and which is the egg. Did having the policies and processes in place lead to them using them more routinely, or had they made a decision to use them routinely and therefore they put the structures and processes in place to support that? Okay, so in terms of, so what we did was we looked at 24 contracts in depth. This was really hard. We had planned to do more than 22 contracts. In fact, I probably shouldn't do that in case this goes on YouTube. But what we needed was we needed contracts where they had good quality monitoring data in place that we could collect and analyse. And finding organisations that A, were willing for us to come in and root about and look at their data, and secondly, finding ones that actually had good quality data in place, that was more tricky than you might imagine. So that was one constraint. The other constraint was we wanted to try and get a variety of different kinds of contracts. So of the 24 contracts, the smallest was about 700,000. The largest was 824 million. So the £824 million is the I keep calling it the Southern General, the Queen Elizabeth II University Hospital on the south side of Glasgow. Fourth Replacement Crossing is the other big contract that's in it. I think it's a £790 million contract. So whilst I'm saying there's 24 contracts and they're worth 2.2 billion, actually 1.6 billion of that is accounted for by just 2 of the contracts. Of the 24, 17 were over £4 million. And £4 million is important because going back to the Procurement Act, £4 million is the point at which the requirement to consider a community benefit kicks in. Okay. In terms of other variations, we tried to get them across the country. So I think the one that was furthest north was for Highland Council. You know, mix of kind of different types of organisations. So we had some housing associations, some local authorities, Transport Scotland, NHS, HMP, so Her Majesty's Prisons actually. The 3 of the projects in it were prison projects. They were quite keen to be involved. What else is there in variation? I think the big thing for me is that because we had to take what was there and what we could get, 18 of them were construction contracts. So 18 construction, 3 repair and maintenance, and 3 service contracts. So again, that reflects the kind of broader usage of them. So what I've got on this slide is really some text about what were the outcomes and the impact. So what we basically asked them about was, we asked them about what were your targets, what did you achieve, to what extent was what you achieved additional. So what I mean by that is, let's say the priority group was a young person who's outside education, employment and training, and what we're doing is we're trying to get them into employment or into an apprenticeship or into a work placement. Okay, let's say they got 10. What we're talking about when we're talking about additionality is how many of those 10 would they have taken on anyway. So sometimes that was, sometimes that was 10, but actually it never was 10, but sometimes it would have been, they would have taken on 9 of them anyway, but actually the community benefit meant they took that additional one on, so you've only got 10% additionality. Sometimes it was the opposite end of scale, sometimes they would have taken none of them on, and therefore the additionality is 100%. So theoretically it sits somewhere between 1 and 100, but you tend to find it sits somewhere in the middle. And then the other thing we asked about was sustainability. So if they had taken someone on as a recruit or as an apprentice, were they still with that company at the point at which we interviewed them? Because there has always been a concern about community benefits, about do they take the unemployed person on to work on that contract, and the contract lasts 6 months, but then as soon as the contract finishes, they get laid off. Okay. Now, if that 6 months employment can actually be the jumping off point for moving on to other employment, so it can still have a real benefit to the person, but the concern is about, are people going through short-term employment and not actually getting any real benefit out of it? So that's why we asked about sustainability. So I suppose the one where there was the most data was about individuals from priority groups that were recruited. What we found here was that the targets were kind of in the region of 600-700 individuals from priority groups to be recruited. And actually, I should say, on each contract, the priority group is different, and they have determined their own, what the priority group is going to be. So the target was about 600-700, but actually it was 1,000 that was achieved. So they were 50% over their targets. 38% of them 38% wouldn't have been recruited without the community benefit clause, and 75% were still employed at the time of the research. Now, the thing with all the sustainability figures that you have to bear in mind is that some of the contracts were finished and some of the contracts were ongoing. So there is a real thing about the sustainability figures might be a slight underestimate, because especially something like the forced replacement costing, where it was a really long contract, people that got taken on were generally still employed, so they might be a slight overestimate. So good sustainability in terms of those that were taken on as a result of the CB clauses, but the additionality not so strong. 38% is not brilliant, because that suggests that even though we've written these into the contracts, actually a lot of the people that are taken on would have been taken on anyway. So the clause in and of itself is not necessarily having a massive impact, although 38% is still good. So if we just look at the ones that are additional, what that means is one person from the priority groups was recruited for each £5.5 million that was spent. Okay. So if you scale that up and you think about the 10.4 billion, if we can roll these out across the 10.4 billion, that's about 2,000 people from priority groups being in employment where they otherwise would not have been in employment. But there's a real catch here, which is these are the overall figures. Actually, I was going to say catch, but catches are normally things that are bad. This is a good thing, not a bad thing. I don't know what the opposite of a catch is. There's real variations. So if we actually looked at the contracts with community benefit clauses that performed best, this figure actually changes to one recruit for every £2 million spent. So if we could get all of the community benefit clauses to work as effectively as the best performing ones, actually for 10.4 billion, you would get, what did I say before? I think I said 2,000 before, so you'd actually get about 5,000 people into employment if you could get us using them across all of the contracts, and you could get them performing really well. Similar figures here around apprenticeships. The thing about the apprenticeships are really important, because apprenticeships give individuals the opportunity to develop their skills, have an extended period of work experience that allow them then to go on to build careers. So you can have a job in the first category that is just a job, that is just doing some kind of, some grounds maintenance, or, the kind of general building operative type things. Apprenticeships allow people to develop those skills that allow them to begin to develop their careers. So they're really important. The other thing that's really interesting about the apprenticeship stuff is that it's got a really, really high level of additionality, and it's got a really high level of sustainability. Okay, so the additionality one's a really interesting one, because what we know is, bearing in mind a lot of these are construction contracts, actually the recruitment of apprenticeships in construction is still quite traditional. It's still quite often, you know, Jimmy who already works here is next door's, you know, son that gets the apprenticeship. So actually by opening these opportunities up to young people that might not normally access them, this is a really kind of important element. Work placements and training, again, the numbers in terms of work placements and training are much, much larger than the targets that were being set. So the community benefits were setting targets on the training. The target was in the region of kind of 1,000, and they got nearly 7,000. So they massively kind of overshot the training. It's interesting that the figure here in terms of the additionality for the training, about a third wouldn't have got the training had it not been for the community benefit clause. But actually there's about another third who would have got the training, but what the community benefit clause did was made the training accredited. Now, employers generally aren't that fussed about whether the training they offer is accredited, but if you're an individual, actually having your training accredited is really important in terms of it enabling you to then go on to move on to other employment opportunities. The one area where there was very little evidence of community benefits being used was around the supply chain. So only 3 of these contracts had included community benefit clauses around SMEs being able to access the supply chain or social economy organisations being able to access the supply chain. So there's really not very much that we can say in relation to that because it's just not being used very often. And actually in 2 of those 3 cases it was a best endeavour, so it's not actually even a formal part of the contract. It's, you know, it's voluntary. I think the other impact that isn't here that's really important is about actually community benefit clauses are beginning to become kind of business as normal for a lot of contractors. If you go to talk to some of the big construction contractors, and again, I'm going to add the caveat that we should be using these much more widely than just for construction. A lot of them actually now have, you know, small teams that deal with community benefits. They're building them into kind of their way of working. This idea of recruiting you know, individuals or delivering other services. So one of the things that we did off the back of both the literature review and the research we'd done was we built this kind of, I was going to say model, but that makes it sound kind of fancy in a way that I suspect it's not, about how to maximise community benefit clause use and impact, and it's got 4 stages. So stage 1 is around pre-tender, so that whole idea of actually you need to create a culture around the use of community benefits, you know, bearing in mind that a third don't use them, those that do use them, only about a quarter of them are using them consistently. There's no great evidence they're being used for things outside construction. So these things are about, you know, what do you need to do to put in place the processes or the systems to create the structure. The second stage is about getting it right at the invitation to tender stage, about actually having real clarity about what is it that you are looking for and how that should be demonstrated as part of the procurement process. There's a whole thing about how does this actually get captured and measured and scored within the tendering process. Stage 3 is about the evaluation of tender, so making sure that actually, you know, you've got people involved who are experienced in this, so that, you know, if you have a method statement from, you know, well, actually from the contractor, what you'll normally have is a statement of how many they're going to deliver and how they're going to deliver it. So you need to really be able to take a critical eye to that. And then the final bit, and this is the bit that gets missed a lot, is about actually having the processes in place to ensure that they are delivered and they are monitored and they are evaluated. Because, I mean, that's almost where our piece of work came from. The fact that these things were there as an approach, but we had no real sense of the extent to which they were being used. And I mean, I can't stress enough that actually, unless you have these processes in place, the chances are they most probably aren't going to be delivered, in which case there's a big question about why are we bothering building these into our contracts. So, to finish, I wanted to raise 2 things, because, I don't know, I'm not a lawyer, so I don't really know what the legal issues are. But these are two things that came up quite strongly in the research that I think most probably do have, are worth kind of considering, worth talking about. The first is about what do we mean by community, okay? So there is a big, so when you're setting your community benefit targets, they should essentially reflect the priorities of the community that you serve as a public body, okay? So there's a really good example, Clyde Gateway Urban Regeneration Company. They've worked with their community to generate a list of what is it that they want the community, what are the kinds of benefits they would like the community to get from their contracts, and they've used that to articulate what goes into the community benefit clauses. And the thing is, if it's something, Community Gateway, Clyde Gateway, works in a very specific area in Glasgow and North Lanarkshire. Okay, so it's clear who your community is. But for lots of other contracts, especially if it's a national organisation, it's much more difficult to determine who your community is and what kinds of benefits they should have, or that you should try to generate. There's also that issue about the fact that we found that very few of the contracts we looked at were going for very specific very specific groups to benefit. It tended to be quite generic, unemployed, young people need, etc. And I think that's interesting because there is this thing about kind of lining up the Procurement Act and the Qualities Act and the public sector duty that's within that. Can you use it actually to help deliver or to enable the Qualities Act? I should say the one thing you can't do in this is, let's say you're Glasgow, what you want to do is you want to tackle local unemployment, the unemployment of your residents, but you cannot specify that the individuals are local to your area because that breaches EU freedom of movement legislation. I think the other thing that maybe has a legal implication is around what happens if the community benefit clauses aren't delivered. Now, leaving aside the question of how good your monitoring and your contract management is, there is this really interesting question about, ultimately the contract is for building a new hospital, building a new bridge, the delivery of IT services to a local authority. The contract is not fundamentally about the delivery of the community benefits. So if the community benefits aren't delivered, what is the appropriate response by the procuring organisation? How do they, I suppose it's almost a question about how do they ensure that they are enforced, they are delivered? Oh, I see. And I think the issue that's linked to that is, what if they're not delivered because of the procuring organisations not held up their side of the bargain? So the way this normally works is, let's say you're looking for them to recruit local unemployed people. In an area through your employability pipeline, you normally have a range of services in place that will help people move into employment. So it's often about linking up the contractor with those services. But let's say you stop funding those services, and that makes it more difficult for the contractor to deliver their community benefit clause. What do you do in those cases? So that's it in a nutshell. It's probably not a nutshell. I think I've talked for like 35, 40 minutes. But yeah, I suppose the key things that I think are maybe relevant to you as a group. I mean, there's a whole thing on what monitoring data we think they should collect, but I think that's kind of outside your remit.
Well, thank you very much for that fascinating topic. I think it puts the conscience back into contracts, which disappeared in maybe the 15th century.
Okay.
There's a legal concept, causa, that your contract has to be for the benefit and purpose of society, but that's available.
Okay.
However, anyway, thank you very much for that. I wonder if we have any questions or if anyone wants to pick up directly on some of the things that Victoria raised there. Ross?
I'm completely ignorant on the area, so I don't know much about it, but actually it's a question out of ignorance.
Okay.
The community benefit champion equals, is this an effect on office within Scottish Government?
No. Yes, yeah. So Oh, actually, the other thing, actually, what we could do is we could pass around the mic thing. Do you want me just to repeat it? Okay, that's fine.
Question, I'm not sure if I'm directing this at
No. Okay. So.
What is the community
Yeah.
benefit champion just for like?
Yeah. So the question is about what is a community benefit champion, and is it a kind of, is it a specific post? No, it's not really. It is someone within an organisation who takes on the role of, being the champion for community benefits. So quite often that can be someone within a procurement department, the person that makes sure that actually, any time a new contract is being let, it's the person that is raising, should we be building a community benefit in here, making the links to, whoever it is in, for example, economic development within a council that might be able to help on employability. Sometimes it can be, if it's in something like a local authority, sometimes it could be a councillor that acts as the champion. I think that's local authorities are a very interesting one, in that what you need is not just a corporate commitment to it, but you often need a political commitment to it. So I know a number of councils have actually taken papers to their councillors to approve a community benefit strategy. But no, it's not a formal thing. There's no legal requirement for any of the organisations to do it. It's just having someone who's going to act as, the person who makes sure this happens. Yeah. So it's not. It's nothing fancy.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions. This has been really interesting.
Okay.
I didn't really have any idea about this before, so I'm learned.
Okay, great.
So I had one question I think you probably did answer, but I just missed it when you were speaking, and then one which I don't think you did.
Okay.
So my first question was, who decides what community benefit is?
Okay.
And so I just wasn't quite sure.
Yeah.
And my other question was about, you had sort of said earlier on in your talk that for some types of contract, like construction contracts, it was quite common for community benefit clauses to be used, but in services for contract or services, then maybe still weren't being used all that much. And when you came to your recommendations at the end, you had recommendations for how, if you're using a clause, it could be used more effectively. But did you have any ideas about how we could kind of, or if we could encourage the use of community benefit clauses, maybe for these types of services where they're not so commonly used?
Yeah, so the two questions for those that are, I'm assuming someone is watching on live streaming, are about who decides what the community benefit clause is, and given that they are commonly used in construction but not commonly used in other types of contracts, so service contracts, what can be done to encourage that use, what can be done to make sure that actually there's a greater take-up of them in relation to services contracts. In relation to who decides what the community benefit clause is, that's a really interesting question. And the answer is, and I know this sounds like a cop-out, it depends. So, is it? Okay, that's good to know, I suppose the way to think about it is, you could think, okay, well, a council is letting a roads contract. It's going to be the people in the roads department who determine what the community benefit clause is. But the reality is, that's probably not really the way it works. What will tend to happen is they'll work with the people in economic development or the employability team within the local authority, and together they'll figure out something that might be an appropriate thing to ask for. Okay. What's much rarer is the thing that I described about Clyde Gateway. Clyde Gateway worked with their community to understand what kinds of benefits they would like, and then they worked to figure out, when each contract comes up, which of them might be appropriate to build into that particular kind of contract. So that consulting with your community, that's the only case I know of. I'm sure there are other cases elsewhere, but it's definitely the only one, that I'm aware of. But yeah, so it will be someone within the procuring organisation who decides what the community benefit clause, except, and this is the second bit to the answer of that, is sometimes what happens is in an invitation to tender, it's quite specific about what community benefit do you want delivered. And sometimes it's like any other element of a contract. It is, you know, you set out that you want community benefits and these are your priority groups, but actually you leave it open to the contractors to come forward with their proposition about what they want to do. And I think there's always quite a lot of debate about which of the two of them is the more the more interesting or the more appropriate for the kind of contract that you're looking for. And I think it is really important to have that thing when you're assessing your contracts about how feasible is what they're offering, because I think you can sometimes just get wildly ambitious claims about what's going to be delivered. But actually what you want is you want someone who's like any other aspect of your contract, who actually understands what's the environment, what are the needs of that group, and understands what's actually a realistic thing to deliver and a good process for delivering it. In relation to the service contracts, I think the Procurement Act will help encourage the greater uptake of them across service contracts. But I think beyond that, Scottish Government's been doing a lot of work about raising awareness, raising understanding. You know, I mean, I suppose none of this sounds very rocket sciencey, but you know, that kind of stuff about, are there case studies out there? You know, are you getting people who are at the conferences about this stuff, standing up and talking about their contracts where it's a service contract? I don't think, it's not that there's some nice, brilliant silver bullet. It's just going to be one of those things that, you know, increasing understanding, you know, chipping away at it, and so. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Can I ask, there's a sort of parallel here with the idea, if these weren't public bodies, if these were private companies, then the idea of corporate social responsibility in the private sector, which we're not very strong on in the UK, but much stronger on the continent, for example, in Germany. And the way that they would tend to deal with it would be to throw money at it, at community benefits. So they would build a sports centre or something like that for the benefit of the community. But it is quite, because these are public bodies, they can't do that. They can't throw money at it because it's public money. And so the whole framing of community benefit has to be a benefit to the community, but there also has to be a benefit to the organisation, because it's public
to
money.
The procuring organisation? Okay,
because it's public money that's being used. So there's a tension in that, isn't there?
Yes.
And therefore, it's maybe not surprising that most of the money has gone on to recruitment. Yeah. It's recruiting people because employees benefit the procuring organisation and benefit the community. That I wonder if it's to do with framing it as needing to be a benefit to the procuring company really limits what they're able to do, so they wouldn't be able to still, for example, environmental.
No, they can do, but they can do environmental improvements.
But only if that's presumably of benefit to the procuring organisation as well.
Well, it's not that it has to be of benefit to the procuring organisation, but it has to be of benefit to the community that the procuring organisation serves.
So would they be allowed to use public money simply to fund the benefit for other people? No.
It's, I don't know how I'm going to summarise this question. So the question is really about there being a tension between the fact that it's public money and the fact that you've got to have benefits for the community. You know, that it can't be corporate social responsibility where you just go away and you fund, you know, some nice thing that would be good for the community. That's a really bad articulation of your question, but I think, so if we went back to the bit where we were looking at the legislation. So, I mean, the thing is, we were doing the research as the legislation was coming, you know, was going through that process of being approved. So by the time it was published, it was almost a year after the point at which the Act got royal assent, but actually when we were doing the research, it was going through that process of the last couple of months before it got royal assent. So what we, or at least that was true for the survey, the case studies came slightly later. So what we were looking at was kind of almost what was happening before the Act came in place. But when you look what's in the Act, it is very specifically about training and recruitment, around the supply chain, and specifically around small and medium-sized enterprises and social enterprises, so third sector organisations or supported organisations. And then the third one is around kind of other activities. And in a sense, my concern always is the other activities. So I think there's always a temptation to say, you know, we're building a hospital, or we're building a new prison, and what we'll do is we'll go tarmac a local play park because that has a social benefit, and you're allowed to do that. You know, there are lots of examples in the contracts we looked at where they've done little things like that. But actually, to me, whilst that is a benefit to the community, it's not a thing that fundamentally makes a massive difference to Scotland's economy. And that's really what the National Procurement Framework's about. It's about, and that's about, you know, you've got to remember in Scotland's economic strategy, there are these twin goals of kind of economic growth, but also tackling inequalities. So in a sense, I'm much more comfortable with the fact that a lot of it is about creating employment opportunities for people, because they are real, you know, if you can do that right, that can create a real difference to individuals, but also to communities. You know, if we can increase employment rates, if we can reduce unemployment, you can actually make real, you know, you've got the beginning of making real long-term differences and making real impacts to Scotland's national outcomes. Similarly, if you can build your supply chain, if you've got local SMEs, local social enterprise companies, you know, getting experience on kind of big contracts that they can then go and use that to build those businesses, again, that's going to create more jobs, more prosperity down the long term. So the fact that there is that tension that you talk about, I'm okay with that tension actually, because I think it forces us to do the more difficult, but actually the more fundamentally kind of impactful things. Does that make sense? Yeah. I should say that, but that's because I come from a perspective where a lot of what I do is around employability, around worklessness, around, you know, how do we grow local economies? You know, how do we make sure we've got the right skills in those local economies? Thank you. Yes. Okay. 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 There isn't. It isn't. Well, I mean, there's always scope to do these things, but it's not really built into the processes as they currently stand. So the annual procurement report is a thing that the public bodies will have to produce, and it isn't written in a way which is about talking to the community about what impact it has. And I think I would maybe slightly push back on your assertion that the community are the right people to tell you what impact it has had. Because in a sense, so I'll add a caveat to that in a second. When we're talking about impact, I suppose there's different things we want to know, and this is built into the monitoring recommendations that we made. So one is we want to know, are community benefit clauses being used in more contracts as time progresses? Okay, and I'm not sure that the communities will necessarily be able to judge that. And then there's the thing about, okay, well, did they deliver on their community benefit clauses? So what isn't required is it isn't required for example, a local unemployed person to know that the reason they were employed was because there was a community benefit clause built in. So in a sense, what can happen is that actually, so like my in-laws live in Fife. I'm pretty sure none of them would have any sense of the fact that the fourth replacement crossing, which is this massive programme, has been used to generate actually real benefits for the community in Fife. So I think there's an element of the community doesn't necessarily understand, doesn't necessarily have the insight to know. They'll often know, people in Fife totally know what the impact of the new fourth replacement crossing is going to be on them, but not necessarily the community benefits. But the slight exception to that is, I actually think what is important is, for example, where a young person has been taken on as an apprenticeship, that we're capturing data from them about what the impact of that opportunity has been on them and what they then go on to do over the course of their life. So I think I'm a big fan of building, the people who benefit from something into the valuation processes. But I think for the community benefits, it can be a little bit tricky. And I suppose that's true of this, but true of lots of things. That actually, when we're monitoring and evaluating these things, we need different kinds of research to be done. So the hard numbers is a thing that is hard for the communities to have an insight in. But we can talk to doing that, groups of young people or adults or whoever it is that have benefited on a one-to-one and capture their experiences of the process. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, just on this final question.
Yes.
I was just wondering if in any of the contract you saw some sort of awareness between the parties that breaching this might be a problem.
Yes.
Lawyers tip, because you can imagine implementing some sort of mechanism such as if you fall short of this target by X%, then take X% off this part of the price and then give this.
So there are contracts in the 24 we looked at where there was a penalty that was imposed if you did not deliver your community benefit clauses. So you were meant to deliver 50 and a quarter, and you actually only delivered 40, so you were fined. In the same way that you would have been fined if you were behind on whatever part of, again, I'm going to use construction, but whatever part of the construction you were meant to be at that point. So I think you can do it. So, there is definitely an awareness. I think what there is a variation in is, I was going to say a will to do something about it, but actually I'm not sure it's necessarily a will. It's about, I think people struggle a little bit with how best to do that, because actually often what you're doing really is trying to build a strong long-term relationship with that employer so that they begin to do this stuff, as part of all of their contracts, not just necessarily the ones that they're delivering with you or, that you're funding. So there's a question about the extent to which you can use a stick to enforce it. The other thing is about proportionality. So on a contract where you might get fined for not delivering your community benefit, and you might get fined for not delivering a part of the, the physical build, chances are the fines are much, much bigger for the physical build bit, or the fines overall actually account for a very tiny proportion of your overall contract. So even if you can build a mechanism in, how effective that mechanism is, I think is a really interesting question. The same is true of when it goes into the tenders. Does the community benefit that get scored? And if so, what scoring do you attach to it? Okay, so if it's something that's 5 of the points out of the 100, chances are, it's not going to be the thing that makes or breaks what contract you get. If you attach it, if it's an element of a contract where it's scored 1 to 5 or 0 to 5, and if you get a score of 2 or less, you're automatically out of the bidding process. That makes it it puts a much greater focus. So it's about, I suppose, getting clever about how they're using it, both in terms of setting them up in the first place and in terms of, then how do you monitor and manage it as a process. Is that, answer?
I have an idea.
Okay.
There's so much of what you've said that's fascinating. There's lots of things that I follow up on.
Okay, yeah.
But the Law Society of Scotland last year announced that there's a 42% gender pay gap within the Scottish legal profession.
Okay.
Incredible, and it's one of their top priorities is to find ways to address that.
Yeah.
If you look at fee books of most law firms in Scotland, a big chunk of that comes from local authorities.
Absolutely, yeah.
Now, the problem with law firms is they don't have flexible working, they don't have very good maternity, and the promotion criteria within a law firm indirectly, and I will say this because it's legally also indirectly discriminates against women.
Okay.
Now, the employment lawyers will disagree with me on that, but
Yeah.
I will go toe-to-toe with their analysis. But
better you than me.
you've got no traction often because people do not raise discrimination cases against lawyers who don't like lawyers.
Okay.
So I think there's an opportunity here to pick up with the service contracts one.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Look, all of your lawyers that are working on my files are actually men in their 50s, and we need to change that. And I think there's an opening there to make that argument.
Yeah, so my understanding is what you couldn't do is you couldn't say, we want a female lawyer to work on this.
No.
But what you can do is you can build things in which are about practices and processes that firm has in place. So most of the work I do, because most of it's for the public sector, goes through procurement processes. We're asked all the time about what are the university's policies around gender equality, around race equality, but increasingly what we're also being asked is we're being asked, what does that mean in practice? What does that mean in terms of what training is delivered? What does that mean in terms of salary skills? So you can absolutely build stuff in for the legal services contracts, but you just need to be really clever about what is it you want to achieve. And I think it's really interesting. The gender equality thing is a thing that at Scottish Government level is just kind of moving up and up and up in the agenda. So you would definitely get buy-in to using it, I would imagine. Yeah.
Just comment, the interesting thing you said was there's uncertainty within the profession or within the law about enforceability of these clauses, so there has been. I don't think there is a problem, it just comes into the drafting. But what you'll find is that a lot of lawyers who look at these contracts learn their law in the late 60s, 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
And they learned law that was really made in the early 20th century or in the 19th century. So they've got immediately, this is unenforceable because it's too vague a term, so they say it's too uncertain. But I certainly think it can be. Yeah. I may try and make that argument publicly. If you do think that is
it's as long as it falls within what's in the Act, then I think you can do it. And I think I sit in lots of conversations that are not specifically about community benefits, but are about economic development, around skills development, and the conversation often comes back to, well, everyone sat around this table as a public procurer. What are you doing in relation to community benefits to make sure that you're actually trying to enact these changes that you're talking about? Because the point is, there's lots of things where we don't have very many levers. And I'm not claiming community benefits are going to solve all of the problems, but they're a lever that we can use to try and deliver some of the changes to Scottish society, Scottish labour markets that we want to see. No, thank you for having me.
I have an observation.
Okay.
I'm responding to a wider observation. issue, but maybe I was thinking, well, Stephen, you brought in, if you like, the wider contractual issues. The general issues seem very like, very like what's happened in the last 10 or over years with, say, public trusts, where you have the charities, the charities regulator developing, if you like, a jurisprudence on what is a public benefit. Where there's very good trade-off there, costs against benefit. And I know it's not exactly the same, but in terms of, if you like, the much greater importance of charities and public trusts as a way of delivering public services, there's almost maybe a sense of, convergence. Maybe these are still operating, if you like, in different silos. I suspect they are. But this idea of public benefit is something which is much wider. That's my only observation.
I must admit, I don't know much about public trust, but I suspect you're right. I suspect these may be things that have been developed in different places by different thinkings, and there is probably potential about thinking about how they sit better together.
Well, I think we'll thank you.
Okay. Thank you.